Very happy to have you attend a very fine presentation supported primarily by the University of Houston UH Energy program with additional support from the Center for Public History. We're very, very pleased to welcome Michael Gerrard to our campus. Aside from this presentation, he's been helping us think through some other project activities that we are considering on campus, and Mike's been very helpful in that regard. I don't want to go on too long and cut into his time. We probably allot about 45 minutes for a presentation and Q&A afterwards. But Michael right now is at Columbia Law School, where he is currently the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and holds the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice. He has other obligations and activities associated with that at Columbia. For many years, he was a partner with Arnold Porter in New York and made the switch over to the academic world. And we're pleased to see him involved in the activities that he's been engaged in there. He still works with Arnold Porter, but mostly these days as a senior counsel. Is that correct? Since 2009, Mike? Yeah. And I don't need to go into too much to let you know that Mike is in, I think, the enviable position of being able to carry a very, very effective and influential legal career, especially in the environmental law area and energy and related topics, along with and I can't use the word burgeoning anymore because you've been at Columbia for several years. 6 years. It's almost hard to believe. He is the author and the editor of 11 books, many of them dealing with issues related to climate change, but also in nuclear energy and environmental justice questions, and a range of very central kinds of issues that are important beyond the law and in a number of other fields. I could list all the different activities. He's been engaged a number of different governmental activities within New York with the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the Office of the Mayor, when Ed Kochis was mayor of New York for his very long mayoral period, the Natural Resource Defense Council, the U.S. Senate and the Committee of Public Works, and so a whole variety of activity. We're very, very happy that Mike could spend some time with us because we've known each other for about 10 or 11 years, and oftentimes trying to catch him either before or after he's gotten back from China or someplace of that kind. But without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here. We are at an unusual juncture in history. We are now at a time when the science of climate change is becoming increasingly clear that there are very serious challenges that we're facing, and that there is a pressing necessity to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We're also at a time when the international community in general is trying to grapple with these issues. The U.S. was historically the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, although in recent years China has overtaken the U.S. The U.S. administration is using the legal tools it has, but we now have a Congress that is steadfastly opposed to U.S. action on climate change. So that's going to be the focus of my talk. I'm going to talk about first, how did we get to where we are today in this? What have been the attempts to get to federal legislation? What federal administrative actions are happening? What's happening now in Congress? And what are the implications of all of this for domestic and international climate change and environmental governance more generally? So I'm going to start with a bit of history. During the administration of the first President Bush and Vice President Quayle, there was actually a fair amount of activity. Congress amended and greatly strengthened the Clean Air Act and also enacted the Oil Pollution Act. That was the last time Congress passed any major environmental laws. That was also the time when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated and signed in Rio. That is the overall framework agreement that sets forth the objective of preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, but he didn't say how to do that. The first President Bush supported it. It was overwhelmingly ratified by the Senate. During the Clinton-Gore administration from '93 to 2001, we saw the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol, the international agreement that would try to define how to achieve the objectives of the 1992 convention. The Kyoto Protocol put binding emissions reductions obligations on all of the developed countries. Vice President Gore supported it. He negotiated it in Kyoto for leading the US delegation. But in the run-up to the Kyoto conference, the United States Senate passed by a vote of 95-0 the Byrd-Hagel resolution that opposed US entry into any international agreement that did not impose on the rapidly developing countries, by which they meant China and India, obligations similar to those that would be imposed on the US. Kyoto did not have that, and so President Clinton never submitted Kyoto to the Senate for ratification because he knew it wouldn't happen. During that time, the General Counsel of the US EPA issued a decision saying that under the existing Clean Air Act, EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, but EPA did not utilize that authority. Citizens began petitioning them to use that authority, but the clock ran out on the Clinton administration before any of that happened. During the administration of the second President Bush, the Bush-Cheney administration, one of the first acts that President Bush took was to explicitly repudiate the Kyoto Protocol, saying the U.S. is going to have nothing to do with it. The new EPA General Counsel said his predecessor was wrong, and no, EPA does not have the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. In frustration over that, many states began adopting their own climate change laws, and 10 of the northeastern and mid-Atlantic states joined together to form the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a cap-and-trade program that they hoped would spread nationwide or really be a precursor to federal legislation. The litigation against the federal government for not acting continued, and in 2007, the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, saying that EPA, in fact, does have the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. At the time, that didn't seem to really be all that important because we seemed to be on the verge of legislation. In the 2008 election, both the Democratic candidate for president, Senator Obama, and the Republican candidate for president, Senator McCain, both supported cap-and-trade legislation. And we thought that was going to happen. And so the existing Clean Air Act wouldn't matter much. When President Obama was elected, he supported legislation. And in June of 2009, the House narrowly passed the Waxman-Markey bill, which would have been a comprehensive economy-wide cap-and-trade law. It would have led to a very significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. out to the year 2050, as we see from this chart. But it turns out that the passage of Waxman-Markey was the apogee of U.S. political support for climate legislation. The legislation foundered in the Senate. The next major UN climate conference was coming up in December of 2009 in Copenhagen. It was supposed to come up with a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't do that. President Obama hoped to go to Copenhagen armed with new legislation or the imminent prospect of it. He couldn't do that. And in July of 2010, the legislation officially died in the Senate. That November, of course, we had the election in which the Republicans took over control of the House. The Tea Party dominated that election. and brought to power a faction that disputed the very existence of climate change, even though that up until that point had been a nonpartisan issue. And beginning in 2011, the House began passing a series of bills to try to take away EPA's authority over greenhouse gases and over many other environmental issues. In the 2012 presidential election, we had we saw that all of the major Republican candidates denied climate change, except for one, John Huntsman, who was in only briefly and never got out of the single digits. Of course, President Obama was reelected. He immediately reaffirmed his support for action on climate change and said that if Congress didn't act, he would. And as we know, this past November, there was the election that restored the Republicans to control of the Senate as well and increased their majority in the House. So to look at the evolution of voting in Congress, the Clean Air Act, just looking at clean air legislation, the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970 virtually unanimously in both houses. It was strengthened in 1977 and again in 1990. In both instances, overwhelming support from both Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate. It was not a partisan issue. But 1990 is the last time Congress has passed any major new environmental law. When the Waxman-Markey bill came up in 2009, barely passed the House, didn't get to a vote in the Senate, and since then we've had this whole series of bills. This one is called the EPA Regulatory Relief Act. It really would more accurately be called the EPA Disempowerment Act. It overwhelmingly passed the House, but didn't advance in the Senate. There have been a whole lot of other bills of that sort. So what we're seeing is a growing partisan divide over environmental issues in Congress. The LCV, the League of Conservation Voters, is a group in Washington that ranks votes by members of Congress as either being pro or anti-environmental. When we go back to 1970, we see the blue are the Democratic members of Congress, the red are the Republicans, and we see a yawning divide, an increasing divide in that the Democratic votes have become more pro-environmental, and the Republican votes have become more anti-environmental over the years since 1970. We also, another way to look at it is a study was done looking not only at environmental issues, but looking at general political orientations, liberal versus conservative. And on the top we have the Congress of 1973 to 74. On the left is the Senate, on the right is the House. And we see, they are arrayed according to where they are on this political spectrum of liberal on the left, conservative on the right. And in 73, 74, although in general Republicans were more liberal than Democrats, that's the way around. Democrats were more liberal than Republicans. There was a fair amount of overlap. In 93, 94, there was much less overlap. And in 2011, 2012, virtually none at all. That virtually all the members of Congress, if they're Democrats, are toward the left, and if they're Republicans, they're toward the right. We see a widening divide among the electorate, but not nearly as much. In looking at the same kind of measures, there is a fair amount of overlap in the electorate between Democrats and Republicans on the left versus right orientation, but far more overlap than we see in those they send to Congress. When we look at the House, the new House of Representatives, we see the geographic lineup. The red states are the red districts. Have a Republican in the House. The blue districts have a Democrat in the House, and you can see that the Democrats are mostly in the coasts and in those areas with large Latino populations. In the Senate, red states have 2 Republican senators, blue states 2 Democratic senators, purple states, one of each. So we have this partisan divide, and we have the new leadership of the Congress, the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell.
You've also talked about the economy, and I think you'll grant that you're not an economist, or you've talked about the ACA and you're not a medical doctor. Do you still hold to the position that you're not a scientist? Do you believe that we should even be discussing climate change?
Look, there are a bunch of scientists who feel that this is a problem and that maybe we can do something about CO2 emissions. George Will, the columnist, wrote recently that back in the 70s, a lot of scientists felt we were moving toward an ice age. So, look, I think that the main thing to understand here is the job of the United States Senator from Kentucky is to fight for coal jobs in our state.
The new chair of the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works.
Now, Senator, we're going to talk about your book for a minute. You state in your book, which, by the way, is called The Greatest Hoax. We'll tell you how you can get it in just a few moments. But you state in your book that one of your favorite Bible verses, Genesis 8:22, while the earth remaineth seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. What's the significance of these verses to this issue?
Well, the Genesis 8:22 that I use in there is, as long as the earth remains, there will be springtime, harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night. My point is, God's still up there. And this is the arrogance of people who think that we, human beings, would be able to change what he is doing in the climate is, to me, outrageous.
And also,
those individuals from the far left, and I'm talking about the Hollywood elitists and the United Nations, and those individuals want us to believe it's because we are contributing CO2 to the atmosphere that's causing global warming. It's all about money. I mean, what would happen to the Weather Channel's ratings if all of a sudden people weren't scared anymore?
the likely incoming chair of the Senate committee that will have jurisdiction over the National Science Foundation, well known to you.
Our lead story, has the president completely lost touch with the problems facing America? Joining us now from the nation's capital, Senator from the great state of Texas, Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz, the president goes out there today and he hits it on global warming. At the outdoors at Georgetown University, the planes were kind of drowning him out. I felt bad for him at one point. He was wiping his brow, really hot. I guess that's global warming. So what's the Republican response to this urgent initiative where the EPA is going to be regulating all these companies now?
Well, I got to tell you, it doesn't matter whether you're talking to Republicans or Democrats or independents. All Americans say that our top priority right now is jobs and the economy. And for the president to come out today and say his top priority, or one of his top priorities, is killing jobs and hurting the economy, hurting economic growth, it makes no sense. A national energy tax will hurt every hardworking taxpayer in this country, and it's an example of his being out of touch with hardworking Americans.
Senator Cruz, he said to critics like...
And finally, the continuing Speaker of the House.
So that means, so that's a no to the president's plan?
We haven't seen the president's plan as yet. I can tell you what our plan is beginning to look like and the types of things that we will oppose.
Let me ask you then about energy. We showed your statement on the president's decision through the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. Also, you come out against the president's proposal to cap and trade carbon emissions. So what is the Republican answer to climate change? Is it a problem? Do you have a plan to address it?
George, we believe that our all of the above energy strategy from last year continues to be the right approach on energy. That we ought to make sure that we have new sources of energy, green energy, but we need nuclear energy. We need other types of alternatives. And yes, we need American-made oil and gas.
But that doesn't do anything to
and when it
control
comes to
carbon
the issue
emissions,
of climate
sir.
change, George, it's pretty clear that if we don't work with other industrialized nations around the world, what's going to happen is that we're going to ship millions of American jobs overseas. We have to deal with this in a responsible way.
So, what is the responsible way? That's my question. What is the Republican plan to deal with carbon emissions, which every major scientific organization has said is contributing to climate change?
George, the idea that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen that is harmful to our environment is almost comical. Every time we exhale carbon dioxide. Every cow in the world, when they do what they do, you've got more carbon dioxide. And so I think
So you don't
it's
believe
clear we've
greenhouse
had
gases
climate
are a
change over the
problem in
last 100
creating
years.
climate change?
Listen, there's clear we've had change in our climate. The question is, how much does man have to do with it? And what is the proper way to deal with this? We can't do it alone as one nation. If we got India, China, and other industrialized countries not working with us, all we're going to do is ship millions of American jobs overseas.
But it sounds like from what you're saying that you don't believe that the Republicans need to come up with a plan to control carbon emissions. You're suggesting it's not that big of a problem, even though the scientific
Well, I think
consensus
it is.
is that
I think it
that
is
has
an issue.
contributed
The
to
question
climate
is,
change.
what is the proper answer and the responsible answer?
And what is the...
So that's where we are, and it's very important in looking at what happens next to take a look at how many votes are needed for certain things to happen in Congress. The rules of the Senate require 60 votes before any legislation can get to the floor. That's the filibuster rule. Because of this filibuster rule, there were not enough votes to get to the floor with the Senate version of the Waxman-Markey bill, and so it did not achieve enactment. But without 60 votes, it seems unlikely now that any of the legislation that would stop EPA from acting would get to the floor of the Senate in this coming round. 67 votes in the Senate are needed to override a presidential veto. 67 votes are needed in the Senate to ratify the treaty. It had been for a long time that 60 votes were needed to ratify a presidential, confirm a presidential nominee. A couple years ago in the Senate, they changed the rules so that it's only 51 votes for all nominees except to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so a lot of nominees went through for administrative appointments and federal judgeships under the 51 vote rule. We don't know what the new Senate is going to do. But that brings us to what is really the most important slide in terms of what is going to happen in the next couple of years in Congress in view of the current composition of Congress. So some things are certain. We know that there's a change in the Senate committee leadership. So Senator Inhofe is becoming chair of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. We know that going out of that, there are going to be a lot of Senate, as well as has been for a couple of years, House investigations of EPA and others to try to slow down EPA from acting. We know that there are going to be delays in the confirmation of appointees. Let me move to the open. So those are certain. Let me move to the almost no chance, and then I'll move back to the possible. We're not going to see new environmental legislation, pro-environmental legislation, but I also don't think we're going to see the repeal of any of the existing environmental statutes. They probably don't have the 60 votes in the Senate to repeal them, and even if they did, they don't have the 67 votes necessary in order to overcome a presidential veto. Now, of course, if party control of the White House moves in 2 years, then it's a whole different story in many respects. We almost certainly will not see Senate ratification of a climate treaty. We will almost certainly not see substantial appropriations for foreign assistance for climate change, which is an important part of the UN climate negotiations. Then there's also a statute passed in the Newt Gingrich era called the Congressional Review Act that allows a simple majority in both the House and the Senate to overturn any federal regulation, but that is subject to a presidential veto. So in the next 2 years, I don't see that happen. What I do think is quite possible, and is far and away the biggest threat to environmental regulations, is appropriations riders. That Congress has to appropriate money for the federal government to operate, and Congress can add riders to the appropriations legislation saying that the agency, EPA or whatever it is, may not spend any money doing X. The president does not have line item veto power. So if these riders are put in a bill that consolidates the operations of lots of agencies, it puts the president in the very difficult position of either signing the bill with these riders he doesn't like, or vetoing the appropriations bill and shutting down the government. So that is the game that may well be played later in this year in the next appropriations round. This past round, where a budget was passed, an appropriations bill was passed to keep the government open, did have some minor appropriations riders on environmental issues, but not much. But now with the Senate in control, we, I think, are going to see, with the Republicans in control of the Senate as well as the House, I think we'll see a lot more of that. And it'll be a real question of whether one party or the other is willing to push us to the brink on environmental legislation as well as on various other kinds of legislation. We've seen, interestingly, that the very first piece of legislation that is being called up for congressional debate right now is on the Keystone XL pipeline. That bill passed the House repeatedly and just did again in the House. But in the Senate, Senator McConnell, the majority leader, is allowing open debate, which means that we're also going to have a lot of amendments put in by Democrats. And so it's going to be quite a fight over the next few weeks to see how that turns out. So in the absence of any prospect for new legislation, EPA is working with the legislation it has, and that's mostly the Clean Air Act. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court in 2007 declared in the Massachusetts case that EPA has the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. In order to exercise that authority, it needed to issue a formal endangerment finding, a finding that greenhouse gas emissions pose a danger to the health of the environment. EPA did that. It then issued the first greenhouse gas standards for passenger vehicles and proceeded to regulate stationary sources of air pollution. So in going through the chronology of what's happened administratively and in the courts, EPA issued the endangerment finding in 2009. It strengthened the fuel economy standards in 2010. And when we look at this, these are the fuel economy standards of different countries. And here's the US at the bottom. Here are the EU and Japan at the top. We see that the standards have been strengthened, and going out to 2025 are going to be about twice as stringent as they were when Obama came in. So that is clearly the most important climate change action that has happened so far in the US. Also, we remain far behind Europe and Japan. You know, there's no question that this proves that technologically it is possible to have motor vehicles that are much more fuel efficient than what we have. It is not necessarily technologically possible to have SUVs that are as efficient, but certainly for mobility you can achieve far more fuel economy than we have had. So that under the Clean Air Act, there are a number of programs, and I'm not going to spend time on going through how all of this works. But the next thing that happened with at EPA, after EPA strengthened the fuel economy standards, they issued the first rules on stationary sources, on factories and power plants and so forth. They were the subject of more than 100 lawsuits. Those were all argued together before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. And in 2012, the D.C. Circuit upheld all of them. EPA won on everything, all of these regulations that it had issued. In 2013, EPA proposed rules under a different program of the Clean Air Act on limiting emissions from new coal-fired power plants. And then last year it proposed rules on emissions from existing power plants, and I'll return to that in a minute. In June, these cases challenging what EPA had already done got up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld most of them. It struck down one corner of it, but the rest of it was upheld by the Supreme Court. So much of the focus now is on existing coal-fired power plants. When we look at the principal emission sources, the greenhouse gas emission sources in the U.S., there are two that stand out: coal-fired power plants and motor vehicles. So these two are far and away the biggest sources. The motor vehicles have already been regulated under what I just showed you, and now they're trying to regulate the coal-fired power plants. Many of the, and this again shows that power plants are, among stationary sources, far and away the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So our existing fleet of coal-fired power plants is aging. We look at the capacity and the year it was opened up, going back from 1950. Most of the coal-fired power plants that are operating in the U.S. Were built between the mid-60s and the mid-80s. Many of them are inefficient. Many of them lack modern emissions controls and are grandfathered for many of the rules. And a major priority of the environmental community is to try to shut down as many of them as quickly as possible and replace them with renewables and possibly nuclear. So the light-colored ones is the capacity where the retirements have already been announced, but many remain open, and these are the targets of these new regulations. So first, the regulations on new power plants are a prerequisite to regulations on existing power plants in the peculiar way that the Clean Air Act is written. So EPA proposed these standards in September of 2013. As currently proposed, they would require carbon capture and sequestration, which is not really in widespread use anywhere. But these in themselves aren't that significant because almost nobody is building new coal-fired power plants in the U.S. anyway because of inexpensive natural gas. But they're a prerequisite to the rules for existing plants. Those rules were proposed this past June. The final rules are due in the summer, next summer. And what they do is EPA issues an emissions performance goal for every state. Each state has to come up with its own plan for how to meet that goal. And if the state does not come up with a satisfactory plan, EPA can come in and impose a federal plan on top of the state plan. So the proposal may give the states a number of options for meeting these objectives. They can make their power plants more efficient. That's not controversial, but it doesn't get you very far. It maybe achieves 5 or 6% reduction in emissions. They can substitute natural gas for coal, and obviously a lot of that is happening. Beyond that, it gets more legally controversial because it requires actions outside of the fence line of the power plant, and there's a legal question about whether they can do that. They can put in more renewables, they can keep their nuclear, the states can keep their nuclear capacity, they can support energy efficiency in customers. 3 lawsuits have already been filed challenging these rules. They're probably premature because the rules aren't final yet, but when the rules do become final over the summer, there will undoubtedly be more than 100 lawsuits of challenge following them. It'll take several years for them to be resolved. And the big question is, do the courts grant a stay on the rules during the litigation? Do the courts say that while we're deciding whether or not these rules are valid, they can go into effect or they have to be stopped. The last round, the round about the endangerment finding and the motor vehicle rule and so forth, the courts refused to stay the rules, so they went into effect. So we'll see later this year what happens, whether these rules are allowed to go into effect or not. If they are allowed to go into effect, most of the hard work on implementation will be in the term of the next president. So it's another reason why who is elected next time is so important. Now, I've been talking about what the US has been doing. Let me put this in a global perspective. Looking at global temperatures, this goes back 20,000 years. Human civilization all arose and developed during the Holocene geologic period. And that was a fairly narrow temperature range. There were fluctuations, it went up and down, but the range was fairly narrow. We are now outside that range. Since the great growth in global temperatures, since the Industrial Revolution puts us about 0.8 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and it's a higher level than experienced over the last 10,000 years or so. The UN discussions have led to a consensus that the maximum tolerable increase in global average temperatures is 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial conditions. We're at 0.8 degrees now. 2 degrees is the goal. Now, at 2 degrees, a lot of bad things happen. At 2 degrees, the small island nations are all underwater. They've drowned. The small island nations are calling for 1.5 degree goal. We have a tremendous increase in sea levels, in extreme precipitation events in some parts of the world, in droughts in other parts of the world. One of the effects of climate change is to make the wet places wetter and the dry places drier. So in some places you'll have more flooding, other places you'll have more droughts. Lots of things happen at 2 degrees. If we don't keep to 2 degrees and keep on going up, things are much, much, much worse. So where do we stand now in keeping with within this 2 degree goal? This is a complicated chart, but let me explain. There are a lot of climate models out there, and this sort of summarizes what the climate models say in terms of carbon dioxide emissions going forward. The historical emissions are shown here in this portion of the line. A continuation of business as usual emissions by the end of this century would get us somewhere in the 3 to 5.5 degrees centigrade range, which would be utterly catastrophic. In order to have any confidence of staying within 2 degrees, we need to be way down here. If we combine the proposed EPA regulations and everything else that President Obama is talking about, and we take a look at what China voluntarily pledged a couple of months ago, and I'll return to that in a minute, and we add to that the pledges that Europe has made, we add all those things, that brings us around here, around 3 degrees. And so what that means is we need to do the Clean Power Plan, the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from existing coal-fired power plants, and a whole lot more. And China and Europe and the rest of the world need to do a whole lot more in order to stay within this 2 degree objective of the maximum tolerable increase in global temperatures. It is a major challenge to do that, and there is less and less optimism that we will achieve that. This also leads to the question of the carbon budget, the question of how much more carbon, how much more fossil fuel we can burn and still stay within the temperature range. But this will take me a few minutes to explain, and I'll get into it in the question period if there's interest in that. Current U.S. policy, U.S. actions are not consistent with a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel. The position of the Obama administration has been schizophrenic on climate change. On the one hand, EPA is taking the actions I've talked about to reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants and other sources. But at the same time, as all of you know, we're seeing an amazing increase in oil and gas production in the United States as a result of hydraulic fracturing technology. So we see on the left what's happened to oil production from these technologies, and on the right what's happened to natural gas production as a result of these technologies. They have been soaring, and they are not done soaring. This is a projection about how much oil production we'll have from the middle Bakken zone in North Dakota, and so we're about here. And this projection shows a whole lot more oil is going to be produced until it begins to subside. With respect to coal demand in the U.S. has gone down as a result of environmental regulations and cheap natural gas, but production hasn't, and so the result of which is we're exporting more. We are exporting the coal, and so instead of us burning it, it's being burned in other countries. So as I said, we did see an agreement reached this past November between the presidents of the U.S. and China, a voluntary agreement not binding on either side, but one of the things that China said it would do would be to have its greenhouse gas emissions peak in 2030 and then begin to decline. The U.S. Was long the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, but China soared past us around 2007 and has been on a steep upward trajectory. Now, to be fair, something like a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions from China are for the manufacture of goods for export. So the US and Europe have exported a lot of our polluting to China so they can make goods that we take in. But it is growth in China's greenhouse gas emissions that are really dominating the world situation. China, as I said, is not bound by the agreement, by the handshake in November, but they have very powerful domestic reasons to want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and their air pollution from coal and other sources. First, let me just show an illustration of the growth of energy use in China. These are two views of Shanghai, 20 years apart. And it sort of illustrates where that energy is going. But in terms of the motivation that China has for doing something about this, anyone who's been to China recently knows that the cities of China and some of the rural areas are absolutely choking in air pollution. That the air pollution in China is leading to the premature deaths every year of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. And this in turn is leading to a lot of domestic unrest. The air pollution in Beijing, this is the World Health Organization's line for what's a healthy level of air pollution. This is the level of air pollution in a U.S. airport smoking lounge. And this is what you often find in the ambient air in Beijing. It is a horrible problem for China, including politically, and they really want to do something about it. One of the things they're doing about it is they've launched pilot programs in 7 cities and provinces for cap and trade, an emissions trading program to try to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The plan is, in a couple of years, to take the best features of these pilot programs and make it a national cap and trade program. If that happens, it will become the most important greenhouse gas regulatory program in the history of the world, and it will be a market that will dominate global emissions governance, and other countries are going to want to join in that. A study came out looking at what the world would have to do in order to stay within 2 degrees. This is called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And so this is the top line of the overall global emissions that would be needed in order to stay within that range. And what they're allocating, this is just their supposition, China is at the bottom. And interestingly, they have China peaking around 2030, which is what China just voluntarily agreed to. The U.S. is here. They're showing a dramatic reduction in U.S. emissions. Now, the one thing that raised my eyebrows is this is India. They're proposing a large, it's not a matter of proposing, but hypothesizing a large increase in India emissions to get its per capita emissions down to, comparable to China. Now, whether or not that happens, we don't know. But the other thing to say about this is there's almost nothing for Africa. South Africa is in there, but nothing else. That's because Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, has just trivial energy consumption on a per capita basis. This is a nighttime view, consolidation of a lot of photos, but it's a good depiction of where energy is used. And if Africa takes off economically, and there are a number of signs that that is happening, then we'll see a lot more emissions from there. So what all this means is that we need every major emitting country to make major reductions, that if anybody waits for the others, we will never get anywhere close to being there. And the final point of all of, well, almost the final point, there are also the states that can act. And this, two familiar characters, former mayor of New York at that time, and then governor of California, who originally became more prominent for other things. But the two of them became leaders at the state and local level in taking action. California actually in many ways is the leading jurisdiction in the world today on taking action on climate change. Most of the states have climate action plans, are doing one thing or another. This shows sort of the difficulty we have. One of the most important things states have done is they've developed these renewable portfolio standards. These are policies that the electric utilities in the state have to acquire a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. But these plans are all different. The different states have different definitions of what's renewable. They have different objectives. They have different timetables. So you don't have consistency, which means you can't really have an effective cross-state market because all the characteristics are all different. Without some consistency, we can't get anywhere close to achieving what we need to. And many of the states, this was 2014. It's different in 2015. Are refusing. Have governors who would not take any action. So the final thing to say is that the sooner we turn the picture around, the sooner we bend the curve and begin reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the shallower the transition, the more gradual the transition can be. We already see that the proposed EPA regulations are too steep for many in Congress and are requiring too rapid a drop-off in emissions. But if we wait longer and still want to stay within 2 degrees, we're going to need a steeper decline. In my the climate change law class that I teach every spring, last year at the last class, a student raised her hand and said, "Professor, this course has been something of a downer." And regrettably, that's right. And there is only limited good news, but we do know that there are technologically potentials for getting the emissions reductions where we need to be. We do not currently have the political will to do that, but I'm hoping, I'm not saying I'm predicting, but that I'm hoping in the next couple of years that that political will emerge and we can get off this disastrous path. Thank you.
Mike is very willing to to take questions from you. That staying right up line. So this here, and we'll go back and forth. Please.
So it's clear where the politics are headed. But what about the economics? Solar is becoming a lot cheaper. Can the economic forces essentially make the politics irrelevant?
Not without governmental intervention. I mean, certainly the price of solar cells has been declining even faster than the price of oil. But fossil fuel combustion continues to be able to discharge greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for free. And as long as we don't have a price on carbon, it's going to be very difficult for the economics to work themselves out sufficiently to have the massive kind of transformation that we need. I don't think it's foreseeable that without a major change in government policy, we're going to see a transition to renewables at nearly the pace we need, and certainly the astonishingly low price of oil is not going to make that any easier.
I was just curious in your opinion as to why the United States has not pursued, using nuclear energy as an alternative for carbon, fuel power plants and so forth, and what are some of the impediments from implementing?
I think it's mostly the economics. Nobody has. There are now 5 nuclear reactors that are under construction in the United States. Until these 5 were under construction, nobody had ordered a new nuclear power plant in the U.S. since 3 Mile Island in 1979. They were the subject of enormous cost overruns. The surest way for an electric utility to go bankrupt was to try to build a nuclear power plant. The nuclear power plants received massive federal subsidies. And the only nuclear power plants that are under construction today are enjoying massive federal subsidies and are in states that have not restructured their electric utilities, meaning that whatever it costs can be passed down to the ratepayer. In any state where there has been deregulation and a nuclear power plant would actually have to compete, nobody's even thinking about building a new nuclear power plant. So there of course, continues to be some environmental opposition to nuclear. I think that's subsiding. It's not gone yet, but some in the environmental community have realized that nuclear power needs to be an element of the solution. If I wanted to build a new nuclear power plant today, it would be at least 10 years and at least $10 billion before I got the first kilowatt. I could get a lot more kilowatts a lot faster and cheaper with renewables. Most of the scenarios I've seen for what it would take to get on the emissions pathway that we need include an element of nuclear. They absolutely do, but much more of it is achieved through efficiency and through renewables. Nuclear is part of it, but under no plausible scenario that I've seen is it a panacea.
Yes, go ahead.
COP21, all the rest of the nations of the world get together and decide to pass a plan that would keep us on the 2-degree pathway and would get congressional support. What does it look like? Is it a carbon fee around the world for everybody that the United States has to agree to continue trading? Or?
So COP21, of course, is the conference of the parties coming up in Paris in December this year. The next effort to come up with a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. But of course, no country is bound by the agreement, by these agreements, unless it itself consents. And so the rest of the countries can't get together and gang up on the U.S. and tell the U.S. you must do this without our consent. I think the most likely outcome of the Paris conference, we seem to be heading in the direction that we'll have non-binding pledges from every country, including the U.S., including China and Europe. These will be non-binding, unenforceable, and they won't add up to nearly enough. they'll probably add up to about the 3-degree range. And they will then call for increased ambition, is the jargon in the UN, try to get countries to do more. So I think that's the most likely outcome, and it's not going to be enough to get us on a 2-degree pathway, even if everybody did what they promised to do.
And would Congress support that?
No, not the current Congress. No way.
That's my point. That
Right.
there must be something that the world can do that the Congress would decide is in our best interest to go along with.
I'm all ears.
Well, that's what I suggested. It's the CCL, Citizen Climate Lobby idea turned around, where the rest of the nations agree that there's going to be a significant per ton carbon fee on each nation, and if the United States doesn't go along with it, then our exports will be taxed at the borders wherever we export them.
So there are a lot of questions. I don't see how that is legal either under the WTO. That if the U.S. hasn't consented to that, nor do I think we'll have all the other nations agree. And Russia is a big emitter, and Russia has not been especially eager to undertake large emissions reductions either. So I think that is a unlikely scenario.
Yes.
You mentioned nuclear as a potential option, and of course you talked about the overruns and the cost expenses. But one of the things that, from what I've studied, is that the cost differences are so high because there's not one particular standard of nuclear development in this country. Can you talk a little bit about why that's so, and also what is the prospect of something like that coming into focus, or potentially even looking at the French, who generate 80% of their power via nuclear, as a model that we can use?
So where we're really seeing massive growth in nuclear today is mostly 2 countries, China and South Korea. And China and South Korea are both are undergoing major programs of nuclear expansion. I would rather look to South Korea than to China. China is using a lot of different technologies. There's a lot of question about the intensity of the oversight, let me just put it that way. There's concern about whether that's all going to turn out well. South Korea has developed a more of a uniform model, and they are approving these plants at a more rapid rate. They seem to be to a higher level of design, and that's where I would look to as a model. I think it'll still be some time before the investment community is satisfied that these are safe enough investments to fund these without massive federal subsidies, but there is some prospect for that over a period of years.
What about the French?
The French have not been building a lot of nuclear power plants lately. They're mostly using their older fleet. But you're quite right that about 80% of their electricity comes from nuclear.
In terms of the growing divide you talked about earlier about positions on the environment, that argument could be used for a lot of different aspects in this country. And I've wondered this for a while, but this is a good topic to ponder it. Is it not the fact that both parties have ushered in a pretty extreme form or common form of gerrymandering, and that's what's in part the idea of creating a divide, and would changing that not help this country return to a better balance, including issues of climate change?
So the reports I've seen on that suggest that there may be, I don't know, somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 House seats that are influenced heavily by gerrymandering. Obviously, the Senate isn't affected at all; those are state borders. And the House, it affects some seats, but with the current composition of the House, even if we had no gerrymandering at all, it would still be a Republican House. And the other issue is that most of the districts are so solidly in one party or the other that they're safe seats, and the members from those districts can take extreme positions without significant fear of being defeated. And so again, that happens on both sides of the political spectrum. And most of the divides turn out to be mostly an urban-rural kind of thing, as opposed to what part of the country. I don't have, I'm going outside of my competence here to come up with a solution.
And so, yeah, so I know, me too. But in terms of kind of the hardening of the arguments or hardening of the positions, it seems like those more extreme on both sides seem to gather all the momentum or all of the dialogue, and that the concept of reasonability, which has been talked about a lot. I mean, this isn't new. I'm just trying to. So, what your argument is, what your belief is, that in terms of potentially changing the attitude of this country, in terms of assumption that climate change is something that should have a little more weight to it, is not really based upon hardened positions, based upon gerrymandering or issues of that kind.
I don't think it's gerrymandering. I mean, there are really a lot of deeper cultural forces at work, because belief or disbelief in climate change is correlated with a lot of other social beliefs. We certainly know that, but we have seen some social beliefs undergo very rapid transformation, and obviously the most prominent example of that is same-sex marriage, where we've seen a very rapid change in public attitudes over the last decade or so. We've also seen that with respect to legalization of marijuana. I'm not a cultural sociologist, but it may be that some of those same influences will have an effect on views toward climate change.
The spending bill that Congress passed in December prohibited the funding of the Obama administration's $3 billion pledge to the UN Green Climate Fund. How do you see developing nations responding to that, and U.S. domestic politics generally leading up to Paris?
So obviously the developing countries are extremely angry at the U.S. for this. Their view is that historically we're responsible for more of the load of greenhouse gas emissions in the world than anybody else. At some point China is going to overtake us in terms of the stock in the atmosphere, but so far it's the U.S. and I think the fact is that most in Congress don't care. When there is screaming from Bangladesh, that has zero domestic effect. So the anger that the developing world feels toward the U.S. is increasing, and that may ultimately have some foreign affairs implications down the road.
A lot of politicians who are opposed to climate change legislation say that it's going to affect job growth, that it's job-killing legislation. Well, if you look at the effects on jobs, there's a time element that never seems to be considered there. Maybe there might be some short-term impacts because you have lost jobs with power plant closings, etc. But then there's actually a long time, incredible cost to not doing anything with climate change. Or are there any studies out there that compare the cost of climate change in the short term and the effects on jobs in the short term compared to the longer term picture that goes 50, 75 years out?
So there's an important ongoing project called the Risky Business Project, which has engaged a lot of economists to come up with projections about what are the economic costs in the U.S. of climate change itself, in terms of sea level rise, drought, extreme weather, everything else that happens, and the numbers are just enormous. There are also a number of reports about how many jobs would be created through a renewable energy efficiency transition, and that is also a large number of jobs. One thing that is often forgotten is if we say it'll cost $10 billion to do all of these wind farms and everything else, a lot more than that, but whatever the number is, that's not $10 billion that are going down a rat hole or going to Saudi Arabia. Those are dollars that are spent, most of it domestically, and creating jobs in the U.S. So a full economic analysis looking at both factors that you quite rightly talk about. How many jobs do you create through building new energy facilities, and how many jobs do you, what is the economic burden of climate change itself? You come out with a ratio that is very favorable.
So I was going to, oh, I'm sorry. So I was going to, I think you finished your presentation emphasizing that it needs to be we need to change political will in order to pass through legislation. I was looking at a few recent polls, and a poll came up from last May that polled Americans and asked, here's a basket of issues facing the United States. Which are the most important things? The economy, education, a whole list of things. And, climate change is one of the issues that was asked. And, unsurprisingly, around 10% of Republicans said that it was kind of only 10% of Republicans said that it was an issue to prioritize. Whereas even for Democrats, it was still less than 50%. It was like 36 or 37% of folks. And so, maybe thinking in a more general realm, like if you had a stack of deck, or if you were to pick the most favorable factors that you could push through legislation, what do you think needs to be in play? Like the economy, the price of gas?
You're quite right that although the polls seem to show that most of the American population believes that climate change is happening and we should do something about it, they still don't rank it very high on the priority list. Right. Compared to a lot of other public policy issues that are out there. A number of people think that what it'll take is some colossal disaster to wake people up. But of course we had Katrina and we had Sandy, which were colossal disasters. And there are now some studies showing how much worse Sandy was as a result of climate change. Climate change did not cause Sandy, but it made it worse. Do we need something that is even much worse than that to wake people up? I don't know. It is not helped by the fact that we have a huge amount of money going into denying it. We have an entire television network that is devoted to denying it. We have lots of other forces out there that are working very hard to sow disbelief, which greatly slows us down and it makes it much more difficult to achieve anywhere near the political support that we do. I wish I could point to a sort of a happy event that would that would change it around. Maybe if there's some technological breakthrough. 10 years ago, nobody anticipated hydraulic fracturing. Right? So who knows what's percolating in some garage now that may develop that will really, really cheap renewables. Maybe something like that will happen, but we can't count on it.
I'm going to just ask something or a statement to react to that too. A lot of respects, I suspect it's a question on the question is posed. It's been clear that, for example, polling on the Affordable Care Act, when people have been asked about whether they support elements of the Affordable Care Act, they may say yes, but if you ask if they support Obamacare, they say no. And in climate change, which appears to be true of a lot of environmental issues, it is a very amorphous concept, and if you began to disaggregate it in some way and present it in terms of elements within it, then I think you may end up getting a different response. Does that make any sense?
No, I agree with that, and as you say, the way you ask the poll is often outcome determinative. But nobody has yet hit upon the formula. A couple of years ago, we saw that it was going to be green jobs. Right now, a lot of folks that didn't stick. It didn't have the kind of impact people thought it would have. Now there's a lot of attention being paid to the health effects, because of course, when you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you're also reducing a lot of conventional air pollutants from the same sources, and those conventional air pollutants have very negative health impacts. So if that message could go through, that you would be saving a lot of jobs in the you would be saving a lot of lives in the near term by shutting down coal-fired power plants, not because of greenhouse gases, but because of the sulfur dioxide and the mercury and so forth.
somebody hasn't asked one yet, and if not, I'll come back. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could expand on the cap and trade program. Seems to be very complex, and a lot of people, especially domestically, use them where the bankers on a trading front. I mean, Europe and London trades quite a bit. But from a global perspective, what China's doing, is there a real universal standard measure? Someone on what impact is actually happening from that country's perspective?
So in the U.S., the major reason why cap and trade became the instrument of choice is that it was an important element of the acid rain program from the 1990 Clean Air Act that was supported by the first President Bush. It seemed to be a Republican idea and received more Republican support than a carbon tax. And that's the principal reason why it was supported. But in the last several years, it became demonized, and it was called cap and tax, and it no longer seems to have that political advantage. You're quite right that cap and trade, as has been implemented in most places, is very complicated and is subject to all kinds of funny business by people in the financial sectors. Now, we have, in the Northeast, as I mentioned, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a cap and trade program that seems to have worked quite well. And so far as it's come out, has not been the subject of this kind of manipulation. The price is very modest, so it has only limited impact. But it seems to be working well for what it does. California now has a cap and trade program just for the state, but they have just joined with Quebec in uniting those programs. That seems to be working pretty well so far. The European emissions trading system has been the largest in the world and has been plagued by various kinds of problems. It has had some good effects, but there have also been instances of corruption and so forth. China is just emerging to see how all of that works. So in direct answer to your question, there is no sort of unified consensus view on the best features of one of these systems, but we do know that under the right circumstances, it can be effective. It's still almost certainly going to be more complicated than a carbon tax.
Professor, this is a downer. As a teacher, can you help us at all with some rays of optimism? Honestly, kids, people less than 40 years old, whatever how you define them, have a really hard time in this classroom where I teach 70 people, leaving the room not having any reason to be optimistic. It almost assures no activism, for example. We can't do anything about it. Are there rays of hope that we can point to and say, here's some things that are happening that are positive that could expand?
So there's tremendous potential that's being demonstrated over and over again with energy efficiency. You know, the International Energy Agency came out with a scenario for what would have to be done to keep within 2 degrees. 39% of their scenario would be energy efficiency in vehicles and buildings and appliances and industrial equipment and so forth. There's tremendous potential. There's also tremendous potential with renewables, and most of the focus has been on wind and solar. As I said, the price of both has been plummeting. There's also a lot of untapped potential with geothermal in some parts of the country, and hydro and various other things. And one thing to say to students is the magnitude of the energy transformation that is needed is so massive that you're going to have jobs for the rest of your life. That building all these wind and solar and hydro and so forth is just going to be an enormous amount of very worthwhile work. And when you're 100 years old, we'll still need it. So it's a massive undertaking, but it's worthwhile, and it'll continue for a long time.
We're back to the George. Sorry.
I was wondering about Africa, if anybody's looking at ways to leapfrog technologies the way they did with cell phones, like they never really got a network of, landlines across the continent, but they've been revolutionized by the cell phone industry, and economies are changing and politics are changing. So as far as energy, is everybody just expecting them to go through the same type of industrial revolution based on fossil fuels, or is there anybody working to coordinate a different program so that maybe we can learn from that experience as well?
Excellent question. There's a lot of work on distributed solar. there are pilot programs in a number of villages where you have solar cells on top of a small building in the middle of the village, and it generates enough electricity so that the houses around it can have basic electricity for a light bulb and a refrigerator. With the plummeting price of solar PV, that becomes more economical. And so there is a fair amount of work being done in that direction, absolutely. I don't know whether it'll be quite as transformative as the leap to mobile telephones that you referenced, but there is a lot of work being done in Africa, also in India, with the same idea.
I was just curious in terms of both general public and our elected officials. One of the issues I see is, and this kind of touches on this disaggregation of benefits and understanding the problem and potential solutions, is that all this doesn't exist in a vacuum, and I never see discussions about nuclear versus fossil fuel versus hydropower in terms of not just air emissions, but all the other things that come into the equation, like effects on endangered species, effects on other things. And it's like we're getting, the people who are really trying to do something about improving our environment and our health in the future are getting defeated by division. And that the Clean Air Act, it deals with air pollution, but air pollution is part of water pollution and so forth. And it seems like if things are being divided further instead of looking at the overall risk from how these things affect, like not just air emissions, but all the other things, we have drinking water, and so forth. And do you see any attempt of trying to look at the real costs and real benefits of any of these proposed actions that the Congress, or because I think that's part of the problem. That's the real costs aren't being defined, or the real risks.
So there have been a couple of efforts to try to look at all of the costs and the externalities of the energy sources, not just the air, but the water and the endangered species,
water usage,
the materials demand, all of that. But the one that I think of offhand is there's a professor at Stanford named Mark Jacobson who's done a couple of papers like that. There are a couple of others that are out there that try to make this kind of a comparison. It's challenging because you don't have a common metric. You're comparing apples and oranges and grapes and all kinds of things. What I've seen, tends to sort of lead to the same sorts of conclusions that look, all externalities included, coal is far and away the worst, and efficiency is far and away the best. And then you've got a lot of variation in between, but there have been some efforts to try to do that all in comparison. The statutes don't encourage it.
Yeah, I agree.
And our citing
there's
system,
no communication. If you look at the agencies, and there's a lot of things that can be implemented that will not only benefit water but will benefit air. And there's no communication or encouragement for that kind of collaboration.
And the benefits of a project aren't necessarily reflected in the ease or difficulty of building it. I mean, with offshore wind in the United States, the total amount of commercial offshore wind capacity we have today is 0. The offshore wind project that got furthest along, Cape Wind in Massachusetts, first proposed in 2011. It endured a whole series of lawsuits and regulatory delays. Last week, the two companies that had contracted to buy 70% of its electricity, really the central part of the financing, pulled out because of the delays, because the deadlines had been missed. And so we don't know what the future of Cape Wind will be. Even though it would have lots and lots of benefits, it would have a few negatives, and the people who didn't want to see wind turbines out their Cape Cod windows were able to exploit those problems and stop the project. So we had a major problem with our process for the approval of the energy facility.
Can you characterize those that are promoting denial. I know there's efforts, legislators, Congress and the state, but what are some of the ideas that strike you about that effort at promoting denial?
I want to be civil here. I mean, I think it has a very, very negative effect. I think that people have seized upon it. You know, the two famous studies using different methodologies, both concluding that 97% of published climate scientists believe that humans are the principal cause of climate change. The 3% get a whole lot of attention, especially from that unnamed television network and other sources. And there's an enormous amount of money backing up those voices. And I think that is one of the major problems we have. It provides a rationale for not taking action.
I'm fascinated by your opinion earlier that the CCL approach, inverse, would be illegal, if I can summarize it in a few words, what I thought you said. So I'm asking, are the citizen climate lobby folks confused about their thought that if we were to implement a carbon fee and dividend in the United States, that we could legally have an international impact with that?
Oh, I'm not disagreeing that if the U.S. were to voluntarily adopt a carbon fee, we could then, it would be tricky, but one could come up with a system of border adjustments.
Right.
You know, there'd be a lot of questions about how do you calculate it. But the idea of a border adjustment so that if a good is coming in from another country that does not impose comparable restrictions to what we have, we could, we can impose a fee. The trade experts I've talked to think that it probably would be legal under the WTO rules. But it would require, the U.S. would have to do it, and lots of other countries would have to do it in order for it really to have an impact. And there are a lot of difficult issues. You're importing a laptop computer that was manufactured in China, but the laptop contains components that were probably manufactured in 100 different factories around the world. And on Monday they buy the covers from Laos, and on Tuesday they buy it from Bolivia. And some of the factories where it's made were powered by coal, and some were powered by hydro. I mean, just the amount of complexity is staggering if you're trying to do when you try to do that. So there could be you could achieve something, but it's very challenging, and it would probably only be able to cover a limited portion of the economy. And would only have very limited effect if it were only in the U.S.
I think I have time for one more before we're done. We'll take those two. Go ahead.
So someone commented earlier on about nuclear power and what they're doing with that in France, but I think it would be also worthwhile to mention what Germany is doing, because they're having a huge gamble on their energy policy, and maybe that might be something that is an experiment that America would follow once they're sure it's working.
Well, of course, Germany, chose this method, feed-in tariffs, which are one of the most expensive ways to subsidize renewables. It was very successful, leading to a soaring rate of renewables, but an enormous cost per kilowatt. And since Fukushima, they've been shutting down their nuclear power plants and replacing them with coal, which is an extremely negative phenomenon. I certainly hope we don't emulate.
One last question.
In terms of professors, this is depressing over the right phrases. I think that I would respectfully disagree with the economics going on. I think that technological innovations and economics can simply make the politics irrelevant, because if you look at the city of Austin, they were able to buy solar power at prices coal to less than fossil fuel plants recently. And this trend can be replicated elsewhere, and I think it will be, because the economics are so darn compelling that these same famous brothers were writing about climate change would find the economics compelling themselves. So I think that there's a potential game changer there that has nothing to do with policy, nothing to do with cap and trade, nothing to do with politics or anything. It's just pure economics at play. I think the potential is there.
Thank you for allowing us to end on an up note.
I want to thank Mike very much for the presentation.